Ahoy! Gearing in New World in Season 10 is an absolute mess, thanks to a massive amount of legendary gear that is very annoying to sort through. But I'm going to try and help you find out what the best weapon perks are specifically in this video. We'll do armor and jewelry later, and what I think you should keep, what you should scrap, and how to do that easily as well, because there are some tricks you can use in order to sort through this a lot quicker. Now, the first thing that I'm going to say is that there are some outliers that we are not going to get into in this video. For example, the perks that you can currently craft that are technically not really allowed. So if you're looking at these rapiers here, there's one here with Disdained Infliction 1 on it. That's an old perk that you're not supposed to be able to craft with the new perks, and as such, this may be subject to change. I'm expecting this will change because some of these combinations are really broken, especially combinations of weapon abilities, like for example having both omnidirectional evade 1 and 2 on your rapier at the same time, which is a crazy damage increase, or the same thing with leeching flurry, which just makes you unkillable. Things like that that are just not balanced. I also need to heavily stress that this is all subject to change. For example, New World Joel told us that the best in slot eventually should be 4-socket gear, which you can currently craft, as you can see here, by using a gem socket, a gem slot, as the crafted perk on it. This amulet is not anywhere near best in slot. It has 4 sockets, but having more protection instead of more sockets would be so much stronger that I'm not quite sure what they're going to do with these perks, but there might be some rebalancing happening in favor of the socketed perks. But for now, this is what we're going to work with. This is the information we have. Before we get deeper into the topic, a heads up that I've posted a very important discovery on my Patreon for something trading and farming related. I will share that with all of you tomorrow, but if you want to have the head start on that and make some gold from it, then consider supporting me there. When it comes to weapons, for the vast majority of players, what you always want to have is a gem socket. But let me explain that real quick. You can see the gem sockets are always the ones with the circle, and there is a good reason why you want one. The damage that you would have to make up for on a weapon to not use a gem socket is first of all roughly that of the half damage of a cut pristine emerald. I think this is one of the most consistent gems that you can have unless you're hitting with multiple players or the target is healing. So you get 16% damage against targets below 50% health, meaning across their entire health bar you get an 8% damage increase. On top of that 8% damage increase, you also can add a rune glass. This rune glass will give you 8% lightning damage per second, in this case for 2 seconds, so an additional couple ticks of extra damage that you also need to offset. And these ticks can also make you proc other benefits, such as, for example, getting extra damage from any enemies affected by dots. Between those added increases, something like, for example, attunement, which just gives you 11% weapon damage, just cannot really compete. And in most situations, you're going to have a very difficult time finding 4 perks, or 5 perks rather, that are better than the gem perk. Next are the actual sockets on the items that are not gems, so anything offense, defense, or skill. These sockets, in my opinion, on weapons should primarily be skill sockets. If you have an item that only has offense sockets, like this one for example, or only has defense sockets like this one, they can still be okay-ish, but I would never prefer them over a skill socket at the moment. The reason for this is quite simple. Offense and defense perks don't really benefit from being on your weapon, while skill perks do. The scaling of any skill perk is stronger on a weapon, so instead of trying to put skill slots on armor and have offense or defense slots on your weapon, you're always going to be better off having skill slots there. The only decision you need to make is how many skill slots you want on your weapon. There are weapons where just having 1 skill slot and 1 gem slot is the ideal amount of sockets to have. So for example, in this case, if there wasn't a defense slot on there. There is an important exception when it comes to PvE. If you're using old enchanted ward on your armor and you want to use new enchanted ward then you have to add that to your weapons and jewelry, assuming you're not crafting the gear yourself, assuming you're using old gear. So that's an outlier. That is where you want to have a defense slot on the weapon. But in most other cases, skill slot is really the only one of those 3 slots that matters in any way. Because anything else, even stuff like keenly jacked or keenly empowered or keenly fortified, can be put on armor. While I was sorting through this, I got this Great Axe, which is, in my opinion, one of the best options that you can get when it comes to having 3 slots, because you have the gem slot and then 2 skill slots, which for the Great Axe in particular, in my opinion, is pretty solid. There are a lot of good skills on the Great Axe that you can use that with. You can, for example, use that with the new charge, but you can also use that with Whirlwind or with Reap or with Maelstrom. There's lots and lots of options, so I actually like having 2 skill slots on the Great Axe specifically, and I was looking for this. With other weapons, you may prefer just 1 skill slot, but then have more skill slots on the armor still if the benefit of the weapon scaling isn't that big and you can get better other damaging perks, in which case again you'd want to have 1 skill slot and 1 gem slot. And there are also outliers where you might only want a single gem slot and that's it, but that's also relatively difficult to get. And that brings us to the traditional perks, the fixed perks, the random rolls, whatever you want to call them, the ones like life stealing and arcane attunement. These ones are the ones that generally provide a lot of damage or utility and are, in my opinion, often the most important perks on your weapon, depending on the exact weapon and playstyle. I made a list of the weapon perks in what I roughly think they fall under at the moment. This obviously completely depends on what weapon you're using and how you can use it most effectively. So this is subjective, of course, but this should give you a guideline of which perks to look for in the first place. So I think attunement in general is just a strong perk to have. It does good damage. Why not? And similarly, End is nice for any ability-focused weapon or any weapon that has a nice attack chain. It's not that great for weapons that have 3 swings in the attack chain, like for example the greatsword or the sword, since those take a lot longer to get to the point of getting effectiveness out of this, especially in PvP. Another very strong perk is Alacrity's Punishment in PvP, which can actually roll on any kind of weapon now, including melee weapons. I personally also think that Keen Speed is still a nice option to have. The duration and the cooldown are identical now, but you can still extend buffs anyways with some new perks, so this should still be fine in my opinion. Sundering Stacks is going to be a bit of a controversial one because in PvE this is an amazing perk and you probably want to have this, or at least someone in your group wants to have this, so it's very useful for that. However, in PvP, I've tested this a little bit, the stacks now drop off extremely quickly since they are not refreshing themselves, so you only really get use of this with an extremely fast attacking weapon and you have to hope that the enemy doesn't have too much debuff reduction. As such, I believe that Sundering Stacks in most cases is not worth looking at for PvP unless you're running something like a Void Blade, for example. If you have a specific playstyle where you think it's good, it's still going to be very good for that. But for the vast majority of scenarios, I believe Sundering Stacks is not worth it in PvP. Some slightly more conditional perks include Plagued Crits, Life Stealing, any form of shirking damage effect, Disdained Infliction, really for dots mostly, Thwarting Counter if you want to play like that, Plagued Strikes if you have a heavy attacking weapon like a Greatsword, Transient Strikes, and Thwarting Strikes. They all have their use cases, it just entirely depends on what weapon you're running. If you don't know for sure, you probably don't want to focus on those perks unless you have a very good reason to. For example, on a Great Axe where you're often AoE attacking enemies, I think Life Stealing is a very nice option to have, whereas on other weapons that are more single target focused, and if you're not particularly going into a leeching build, I would value it less compared to a secondary attunement. And then we have the very conditional perks. I wouldn't necessarily say these are bad perks, some of them can be useful in very specific builds, but if you know why this perk is good for you, then I don't need to tell you about this perk. So this is just super niche stuff, and for the vast majority of players, probably not that useful, probably not that important. The first one of those is Penetrating Empowered, which is just too crit reliant to get its effectiveness, so for crit niche builds really. And similar things with Purifying Crits, which I think is a cool perk, but it just doesn't hit that hard most of the time. Other perks include Sure Footing, Mortal Aggression, unless you're going for a very high kill build in PvP, or maybe some group farm in PvE. Exhausted Exploitation, Fractured Rend, Desperate Empower, and Sturdy. So now what if we actually want to sort through this gear? We have this nice little input thing here, which actually allows us to look for specific things. So I could, for example, say I want to see Disdained Infliction, and I just type in Disdained, and here we go. This just leaves us with the weapons that have Disdained Infliction on them. And we can use this to see also what has a gem socket by just doing gem instead, and likewise what doesn't have a gem socket by putting -gem. So very easy way to filter through your gear. You can just do the gem search and then just look through these ones, log what is relevant for you, whatever perks you think are interesting, and then mass salvage the rest. So let's actually do that once here. For example, here we have Disdained Infliction on a hatchet. I don't want that. Likewise, this one looks kind of okay, but also doesn't have anything particularly special. I'm gonna lock it because it has double attunement, but that's about it. This one is a great X with skill slots, but I don't really use Transient Strikes, so I don't want that. Desperate Empower, not good enough. Double Shock here is kind of nice, but I don't really want Shirking Shock that much, and I also don't have a skill socket on this one. This one has a skill slot, but comes with Thwarting Counter and Shirking Shock, so I don't want that. And this one comes with a shock attunement at end, which is nice. So it's gonna get a lock, but it doesn't have a skill slot, so it's probably not gonna be a priority. The best one out of the bunch was the one that I already locked earlier, just so I don't actually salvage it during the run, which was the double skill slot and the gem slot. And now we have sorted through all the items that I want to look at, because I don't care about anything that doesn't have a gem socket, and I don't care about any of these because we just looked through them. And instead of manually doing all this every time and clicking on it, or doing the control, quick salvage and confirm, we're just going to press mass confirm, select all, confirm, done. Like that, you can sort out your inventory way quicker than any other way at the moment. Alternatively, you can also just not even search for gem and just hop through the items that have gem sockets and then move on. Unfortunately, I don't know if there is any console equivalent of this. Now, one thing you may have heard is that faction gear is an amazing option to gear at the moment. And in some cases that is true. We will get to that with certain armor pieces. But there are some limitations. So you have to go down to the ancestral gear, and you will see that, for example, this sword here comes with a PvP perk, Penetrating Empowered, which in my opinion isn't that great to begin with, and then comes with Sundering Stacks along with that, which is not that great in PvP. So that's already not such a great mix. And then Transient Strikes also doesn't really work that well with it, because if you want to attack quickly with Sundering Stacks, then you don't really want to do heavies in between and drop off those stacks. So a bit of an awkward mix. No skill slot on these either, which holds them back a little bit. So in the case of the sword, for example, not that great. On the other hand, if you look at the Void Gauntlet, for example, you have Alacrity's Punishment on that, which is an extremely nice perk. You have Penetrating Empowered, which is, again, still okay if you're going for a crit focus build, which you would do with the Void Gauntlet anyways. And then Sundering Stacks is going to stay much better with the blade. So again, not a Bis Void Gauntlet here, but definitely an okay starting option. If this had a skill slot, I think this could last for quite a while. So you have to look through the individual items, and you will see that some of them are better, some of them are worse. Generally, I would say the weapons are not as good as some of the armor pieces. One that I think is worth having a look at is the Life Staff, because the Life Staff here comes with Savior, Desperate Prayer, and Resurgence. These are Life Staff specific perks, so I don't really talk about them in the context of weapons otherwise. But I think, as far as I've been told by healers that actually use this kind of stuff, these are very good as a combination. By the way, some of the melee weapons also have Alacrity's Punishment, specifically the Greatsword and the Flail, which in my opinion makes them a little bit better than the others, even though ironically the Greatsword could have benefited from Transient. But yeah, there's a bit of a mix going on. Some things are better than others. You know the perks now, so decide for yourself if you think this is worth it. We have not talked about infix perks here, because those are very specialized. However, I'm going to have a video on that in the next days, specifically talking about farming and everything surrounding that as well, because there are some things that aren't really talked about yet that are very interesting when it comes to farming, all this kind of stuff. So if you're interested in that, consider subscribing and clicking the bell, and that will come very soon, and I hope be very useful. Other than that, I just posted another trading tip on my Patreon, kind of the weekend moneymakers that are coming out right now. So if you want to see that while the weekend's going, then consider supporting me there. Thanks to all of my patrons who already do exactly that, and thank you for watching. Duke Sloth, out.